Hello, folks, and welcome to the Aftergame. As usual, I will be just blathering on for a bit to give people a chance to join me, and then after that, we're going to talk about industry standards in the tabletop RPG industry, or in some cases, the lack of industry standards in the tabletop RPG industry. I'm specifically going to be talking about writing, and obviously all of this information is going to be based on my own personal experience. Also, to be very, very clear, I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. When I refer to standards, I'm really here talking mostly about the things that I have encountered that happen a lot. I mean standard as in common, not standard as in some universal forces come together and brought all these things and said, this is how it shall be. As always, my wife LJ is going to be co-hosting and will be watching the feed and letting me know if we have comments. And you can always send her ideas for shows or comments on an old show, or if you happen to have direct contact with LJ, you can tell her that way too. So this entire show is coming out of some random comments I made over on Facebook over the past week, where I happened to mention how some things work, and several people, including people who are published in other fields, are kind of shocked at what the norms are in the RPG industry. So especially since a lot of people that watch this show seem to be interested in getting into the industry, or interested in knowing how it works, or have just started to get into the industry and may want to know, is what I'm seeing normal, or am I just working for one weirdo? And by the way, the answer is frequently yes, working for one weirdo, but that doesn't mean that's what's going on in any particular case is not standard, or at least average throughout the industry. So let me talk about first the two things that I think surprise people the most, pay rates and work for hire. Pay rates in the RPG industry are not high, and they are not in general royalty-based. Normally, you're doing what is called a work-for-hire contract, and at least in the United States, that is a contract that says that you are providing this as a service to a company, not as a writer, and that that company is considered the author of the words you are providing. So instead of you having the copyright and then leasing it from you or buying it from you, you're being paid to provide a service. The service is words, but the company is considered to have created those words. So they have the copyright. There's no need to pay you royalties, and you have zero ownership of those words, the concepts, the ideas. One of the things that work for hire means is that you should not use ideas that are unique and precious to you, that maybe you've developed over decades, as throwaway lines in a work-for-hire contract. If you put together a plot line, or create a unique name for an NPC, or use your home college game as the basis for an RPG setting for a publisher, and that's a work-for-hire contract, you don't own any of that anymore. You have sold it, work-for-hire, and in that contract, because it's work-for-hire, you have said those things were created by and belong to that company, and you can't use them anymore. A lot of people who do work-for-hire don't know what that means, and they are surprised later when there's stuff they cannot use, right? So like some of the famous named wizards of early fantasy RPGs were player characters of specific players, and when those people did work for hire putting their characters into games, those characters stopped being theirs and they could not use them anymore. And at least in one case that actually led to a cease and desist. I don't think it ever got to a lawsuit, but there was someone who felt that they should be able to use their old character in a product other than for that company, and they can't. So that leads to a second point, which we'll get into a little deeper later, which is contracts. But before we get that, I want to get to pay rates. Pay rate in the RPG industry goes as low as half a cent a word. That is the very low end, and all the way up to about 10 cents a word, and that is actually the very, very high end. I think it tends to average between 3 and 4 cents a word. That's sort of what I consider to be the floor of the professional rate. Certainly there are people that offer 1 to 2 cents a word, and sometimes they offer that because they know what they will make on a project, and that's all they can offer in order to actually turn a profit, or in some cases break even, or in some cases just limit the amount of money they lose. I personally always try and do these things from a professional point of view, so I never write a budget on the assumption it's going to lose money, but I do have to do some reasonable guesses of what are my editing costs going to be, what is layout going to be, how many units am I going to move, what percentage your distributor is going to get, whether that's electronic distributors like drive-through or physical distributors, and therefore how much money is left, how much of that goes to my company, because Rogue Genius has an LLC, and how much do I get for the work I did on that project, whatever that might be. I do, through Rogue Genius, frequently do royalty contracts or profit-sharing contracts. Those are much, much less common. They do exist. The upside of a profit-sharing contract is that if you write something that is hugely popular and it makes the publisher a great deal more money than expected, you get to share in that. You get a chunk of that more money. One of the drawbacks is that you are taking on part of the risk with the publisher. If something is a terrible flop and it makes almost no money, you will get paid your slice of that small amount of money for the same amount of work. I personally like royalty sharing arrangements, especially for small publishers, because I think it is a reasonable way to say, hey, we're all in this together, we're taking a chance. But you need to go into those with your eyes open, because it is not unusual for especially small companies to only move 50 copies of a PDF, for example. And I mean, in some cases, you move 50 copies over the lifetime of that PDF. So if you wrote 10,000 words and it's being sold for $6 and the distributor's getting $2 of that, so there's 4 left, and the publisher is giving you 25% of that $4, you're getting $1 per unit. And so if 50 copies are moved, you get $50. The flip side of that is if 1,000 copies are moved, which is a good deal less common, but can happen especially over months or years for a popular product, you get $1,000. So that means that your rate is somewhere between that 1/2 cent a word and 10 cents a word, just totally depending on how popular that product is. Some people do royalties that or profit sharing that only runs over a certain period of time. For instance, 50% for the first year, or 25% for the first 2 years, 15% over 5 years, whatever. I understand why they do that, because as something becomes less and less and less new, it sells fewer copies per month or per quarter, and it becomes annoying to have to do the math to say, hey, we owe you 15 cents. Do you want that all right now, or do you want us to save it up for the next 15 cents and send you 30? In general, I tend not to do that, because sometimes things hit it big in a different format or hit it big later. I've got products where long after they stopped being the main product, when they were more than 90, more than 180 days old, sometimes when they were 2 or 3 years old, we did a bundle, or we had a sale, or they were mentioned in a thread somewhere, and there were suddenly hundreds of dollars of additional sales. I personally want the people that work on that book to benefit from that. But that does mean more accounting, so there are pros and cons to that. I see that Tom in Bladesight said, I thought you owned Dragonsteel, Owen. He's referring to a material from a book I wrote for Green Ronin, the Advanced Game Master's Guide, and no, that's a work-for-hire book. Now, OGL makes these things a little odd, because sometimes I will write for a product, that product is released under the OGL. I am not legally the owner of the copyright of that, but that part of that is open game material, I can then riff on and build on in other products later, just like I can any open game content that's under an open game license. That's not really an industry-wide standard. I will, however, throw in one of my little provisos right after another. I am not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, that if you're working with any kind of license, the open game license, Creative Commons, whatever, be aware of what that license is and what the restrictions for it are. I know that there are people that have written material, for example, for some of the game sharing projects on Drive-Thru-RPG who were surprised by the restrictions of what they can do with the material they write that they publish, because of the licensing that that publishes under. So if you are in a, and not just something you publish on your own, but if you are, for instance, being allowed to use the intellectual property or copyrights or trademarks of another company under a license, even if that license is arranged for through a publisher like Drive-Thru, read it, understand it.
We have a couple of comments.
I'm told we've already got a couple of comments, so let's go ahead and go to that.
We're ignoring the scream of children, Thomas. Leave that alone.
Yes.
George Loki Williams, all the work he is doing right now is royalty-based, and for him it's better over the long term unless he needs some money immediately. Nick Esposito says you're awesome.
Thank you, Nick.
And Thomas agrees. I thought I saw a question in there. I must have missed it.
All right, those comments. So Loki mentions that he likes doing royalty-based works unless he needs money immediately because he has a immediate need for funding. And that is one of the things that does differentiate between those two. If you do work for hire, if it's a per word rate, kind of no matter when you get paid, and frequently it's not until it's published, but you generally get it all at that time or 30 or 60 days after that time, depending on your contract. And if it is a profit sharing deal, that money is going to be stretched out over at least 90 days, and it easily can be 180, 360 days before you get the majority of what you're making on that. Some of the lowest pay rates I have ever worked for, I worked for them because I was full-time freelancing. There were bills that needed to be paid, and I had a publisher tell me, I can only pay you, I think it was a half a cent a word. It might have been 1 cent a word, but I think it was a half a cent a word. But he said, I will pay you by PayPal within an hour of you sending it to me. And I had bills that had to be paid. So I cranked out a few things and made 100, 150 bucks and paid those bills. Those probably sold enough that I would have made more on a profit sharing or royalty basis eventually, but I had money needs right then. So sometimes what is a good deal for you depends on your circumstance and what you need. Another thing that people should be aware of is that when you do, especially work for hire, but generally speaking, anything that you publish when you are giving a publisher the right to publish it, it's going to be edited, and there's a decent chance it's going to be developed. And what I mean by that is that there's going to be someone who's going to come in and change your words to better fit the publisher's needs. Some of that is just normal editing. So if you used the wrong there, or the wrong to, or to, or if you have put in an M dash where what you needed was a minus sign, or if you've gone crazy with apostrophes and semicolons without knowing where they go, all of which are things that I have done at one time or another. I perfectly well know the difference between to, there, but sometimes I just don't type the right thing. So that's regular editing. But you can also have circumstances where the publisher looks at what you're doing, especially if you're one of the people working on a bigger project, so you're only doing a slice of it. A publisher might, for example, have said, hey, I need a series of feats, and I want a few feats for every class in the game, and you write a bunch of feats that you think are really good for the fighter, and someone comes along and says, well, we have all the fighter feats we need. These feats can be used for the paladin, and that's not what you intended, and maybe they don't make quite as much sense for paladin feats, but the need of the project is that there need to be paladin feats, and yours are the best match for that need. You will not always be told that that is happening. In fact, the standard is you will not be consulted, you will not be told, and you will not be aware of it until the book comes out. And even then, you'll only be aware of it if you go look for it. One of the reasons I frequently encourage people who are freelancing on projects not to talk about things they have done for that project above and beyond NDAs, and we'll get to that in a moment, is that what you think you wrote, what you know you wrote even, may not be what the final book comes out. So if you tell everyone the first day the book comes out, hey, you can all now read my Halfling Warbaker with explosive muffins, and someone has decided we're not going to do explosive muffins, you can get people excited for something you're telling them in the book, and it's not there. So I always recommend you go through and you see what's actually in the book before you talk about it, not only even if you're the writer, but especially if you're the writer. I also want to talk a little bit about feedback. In an ideal world, the developers and the editors would have time to tell you, hey, these are things that are changing, and sometimes they might even say, this is bad and we need it to be improved. Can you improve it? Can we have you do that work to make it better? And again, I'm going to keep saying the word contract. Hopefully you've got a contract that defines whether you've got revisions coming or not, and if so, how many times you have to revise something. Sometimes it's just a case of you are being paid upon acceptance, so you will not be paid until they accept the work, and they won't accept the work until you've made changes they want. But that's actually all pretty rare, because most publishers don't have time for the freelancer to get another bite at that apple. If you've not got what they want the first time, they will just make the changes because their developers and editors are the people that they trust to get that done on time to the publishing schedule. For a publisher, a book that doesn't come out is always worse than one that comes out that has errors, because the book that never comes out can never make them money, but they can spend money on it, and they can advertise it, and they can get people excited for it. And if after all of that the book never materializes, that's a huge problem, especially if you've got a company that has a line that happens on a regular basis, whether that's the old Super Genius Games plan of publishing a PDF a week, or things like Paizo has subscriptions where they've got some that go monthly and some that go bi-monthly. Those are all things where they have a need to meet that schedule, and they probably don't have time to get back to you. Even if they don't have time for you to make revisions or changes yourself, ideally, they would have time to give you feedback so that they can help you be better at meeting their needs. No one I know is good about that, or at least no one I've worked for is good about that, and that includes me. I'm not as good about that as I would like to be. And that's because giving someone feedback is smart and makes sense and is helpful in the long run, but it doesn't help me get what I need to get done in the next 40 hours, done in the next 40 hours to meet the deadline to get published to make money. That is a little bit of being penny wise and pound foolish, but sometimes deadlines means that's what you do. LJ, were you trying to get my attention?
When?
Just now.
No.
Sounds like no. Okay. Just to recap, a few cents a word, starting on the low end, work for hire, you have no rights, you have no ownership, you can't reuse the material, and probably it's going to get changed without you being told about it to meet the needs of the publisher. So I'm reasonably sure I will get people pinging me asking why you would ever do this. And the fact of the matter is, if that litany of things I just listed off scare you off from the idea of working from other people, that's fine. It's not for everybody. And a lot of creators in the industry, even those that have steady jobs or own part of a bigger company, also have smaller companies that they use themselves so that they can do the projects they want to do and own the material that comes out. One of the reasons that even though I work for Paizo and Green Ronin and I do stuff for Raid Publishing, I do freelance and I've got a Patreon and I have a blog, one of the reasons I also still release stuff through Rogue Genius Games is that I own the material that I release through Rogue Genius Games. And that is important to me, which is why that company continues to exist. Another thing that people seem to think, oh, wait, we do have a question. Yeah.
Jason Waltman asks, what is your story about adventure of three-party publisher?
What is my story about?
Being in a third-party
Oh,
publisher.
being a third-party publisher? What is my, let's see, what is your story about adventure of three-party publishing? A third-party publisher is, no Pennywise, no penny, anyway. A third-party publisher is someone who's publishing something through a license. So, and that's a license, a broad general license. So, for example, Paizo is a first-party publisher for Pathfinder material. They create it, they own it, they are that first party. If they make a specific license with someone to make stuff for Paizo, that's a second party. So, for example, when they license miniatures through WizKids, then WizKids is a second party. They are doing things specifically for Paizo using Paizo's license. Rogue Genius is a third-party publisher in that there is a license that exists that allows us to make stuff, and we have to follow the rules of that, but we are not making those things for Paizo. We are getting Paizo's permission to make those for ourselves, making us a third party in the process. I think third-party publishing is here to stay. There's a lot of third-party publishers beyond the people that are doing the open game license. There are third-party publishers for Mutants and Masterminds and Pathfinder and Starfinder and Fate and Fudge and all sorts of things, and D&D, of course. And while I think what is popular and what is supported and what a lot of people are doing is going to change as time goes on, I think that business model is going to remain with us. Yes, LJ?
Richard Balsley asks, are there any work for hire situations for editors?
Yeah, so I generally tackle this from the small press publisher and writer point of view because those are the roles I've actually filled. But yes, in fact, all the editing I'm aware of is work for hire. And that makes sense because while editors, I love my editors. Editors are the only people in the world whose job is to make me sound smarter and help people understand what I wanted to say. I think editors are crucial. But you don't want an editor to say, hey, I changed the name of that character, and so now you owe me a royalty for this one word change, and I can use it on other stuff, and I will make my own products. So all the editing contracts I'm aware of are work for hire. Some of them are still profit-sharing basis, so if we edit this project, we'll give you 10 or 15%, whatever, or projects that makes it. But I'm not aware of anyone who gets any ownership of material that they edited. That may be different for fiction. That's a whole different kettle of fish, which I am much less experienced with, but at least in the game industry. Yes, LJ.
Sorry, I had turned to Evie Man. Couple of comments and then another question.
Okay.
me go back to where I was. Sorry, the screen moves without me. Joshua Hennington, he says he appreciates the work you do, and it's good that you're able to juggle first and third parties, each with different aims. Thomas Lane Seitz, oh God, is there a party in the CIA, and should I worry about the NSA tapping my phones? Yes, yes, there is.
Okay, I'm actually going to take an aside. LJ, find your next question or comment.
I've got it here. Yeah.
Okay, so asking whether you need to worry about people tapping your phones is funny, but sometimes writers' web searches make us look like serial killers. Because frequently you're wanting to know how fast does a poison work, and is there a way that you can create something that someone won't notice, and what are the loopholes of murder rules, and you're looking those up for story purposes or for game rule purposes. When Jeff Grubb and I were working on the Arms and Equipment Guide for the D20 Star Wars game, I had already moved back to Oklahoma. He was out here in Seattle, so we were communicating by email quite a bit at the time. And one of the things we were doing was deciding which droids we were going to represent, and we wanted at least a couple of assassin droids. So we picked them, we talked about them, and a little while later I decided there was a better choice than one of the ones we made. So I sent Jeff an email with the subject line, "I think we've picked the wrong assassin." And right after I sent that, which had the explanation of which assassin droid I thought we should be using, I sent another email a little bit later saying, "By the way, dear FBI, I meant for a game," where I actually explained, hey, if anyone is looking at my emails, if the Predator super scooper email system that grabs everything but only looks at it if they get a warrant, has picked this up, please be aware that I'm not actually saying that Jeff and I need an assassin and we're going to change to Pablo Escobar. So you do sometimes want to be very clear with your communications. Also, at one point, when I was releasing a lot of spells, I think on LiveJournal, I had someone who was getting into paganism who thought I was saying that these are spells in the real world that work. Now, that's only ever happened to me once, but again, you want to be clear in your context of what you're saying, what you're doing, and why you want this information. Okay, LJ, what's your next thing?
I'm going to make a couple more comments and then I had a question for you. Neto Carvalho. I know I pronounced it wrong last time. Anyway, please go back to doing your old short videos on YouTube. If you can, they were hilarious.
Thank you very much. I plan to. It's a matter of timing and material.
Come on. Edward Moyer says Starship Stations and salvage for the win. Okay. Then I'll go back up to the question that was from, or another comment actually from Michael Toomey. He points out that as a cartographer, he actually went from an entirely different direction and made his own stuff based on what he wanted to do, and it maintains the copyright to those. Yeah,
Michael Toomey is a great cartographer and has come out in the industry in a very, very different way than I have. That said, my guess is that if he was hired by a publisher to do maps for some project of theirs, they would present him with a work-for-hire contract. But it is absolutely true that if you want to be your own publisher or you want to work with a small publisher and you come up to them in front and say, hey, I am interested in having a publisher for this work, but I want to retain the rights to this work. Like Ray Valise's Editing with Style, which is a book that Rogue Genius published. It's editor's advice to RPG writers. It's a great book. We are thrilled to get to publish it. We own the trade dress of the cover because we did that work and effort, but he owns all the words. So if we end up parting ways at some point, or if he gets a great offer from if a major publisher came to him and said, hey, we'd like to take this and do a bigger version, he owns all that. Our contract specifies that. So a quick word about contracts. I would like to say that contracts are the industry standard. They're more normal than not, and all of the big publishers, in my experience, use contracts. They're not always great contracts, but they are contracts. I beg of you, don't do any work for anyone. If any money, any rights, any obligations, or any expectations are changing hands, you need a contract. And even if it's not in ironclad legalese, that contract will pin down expectations, pay rates, how the rights are transferring, deadlines. Hopefully it'll cover things like revisions, whether or not there are kill fees, who has final say on something. It would be great if everyone would just say, hey, if there's not a contract, I'm not going to do this work. And I mean, yes, even for your family and friends. If any of those things are moving back and forth, please get a contract.
And if anybody gets offended that you ask for a contract, just remind them that it's protection on all sides and it has nothing to do with personal relationships.
Yeah. And if you run into someone who just doesn't want to come up with a contract, you can find contracts online. Most small party publishers are happy to let people borrow their contracts and change the names out. So there have been a couple of cases where someone said, I don't mind having a contract, I just don't want to take the time to write one. And I'm like, okay, great. Here's a contract. This is my proposal. And then they just have to read it. Yes, reading 2 or 3 pages of contract is no fun, but that is part of the cost of doing business in our hobby.
Owen?
Yes?
For Brandon Burken, can you explain kill fees, please?
Kill fees. A kill fee is when you have agreed to do a project and for whatever reason that project isn't going forward. So it is a fee that you are being paid because the project has been killed. So for example, I was working on D20 Spectaculars, which was a superhero supplement for D20 Modern that Wizards of the Coast was going to do. And I was paid 1/3 of my total fee in advance. That's not nearly as common. It was never common. It is even rarer now. But at the time, I had a really good relationship with them. So when I agreed to do a project, they paid me 1/3 in advance and 2/3 upon acceptance rather than me having to wait upon publication. For various reasons, none of which were my fault, that book got canceled. And so the people who were my contacts at Wizards of the Coast said, okay, we know you've done a good deal of writing. We want to pay you for that writing. That means that the contract has been fulfilled. We're amending the contract.